Darkness. A vast, unbroken abyss stretching across infinity. A single ship drifts through it, silent and slow, its matter black hull nearly invisible against the void. No running lights. No beacon. No sign of life. Inside, the hum of machinery pulses like a distant heartbeat, faint but steady. The ship's name, barely legible under the scarring of time and radiation, is etched into the metal near the airlock. Erebus 7, a salvage hauler, long decommissioned. It shouldn't be here. Yet, there it was. Floating, waiting. A lone vessel, the Calypso, closed the distance, engines thrumming softly in the dark.
Dear audience, before moving forward, I would like to say, your support means the world to us. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, press the bell icon, and share this video with your friends to keep us motivated as we bring you valuable content.
A standard survey mission had turned into something else entirely when Erebus 7 had appeared on long-range scans. No registry ping. No distress signal. Just there, like a ghost from another time. Inside the Calypso's cockpit, the pilot adjusted the thrusters, nudging the ship closer. The others stood behind, watching the hollow, lifeless shape of Erebus 7 fill the viewport. Someone exhaled sharply. This thing looks ancient. Shouldn't even be intact. A ship that size? Unregistered? It's been drifting for decades. No radiation leaks, no hull breaches. Just dead. That was the word for it. Dead. The ship's scanners swept over the Erebus 7, searching for movement, power signatures, anything. But the results came back the same, over and over. No life signs. No atmosphere. Just silence. And yet, someone had been here. Or something. Docking was a slow process, a careful dance between two bodies in space. The airlock hissed as the boarding tube latched onto the Erebus 7's external hatch. A moment of stillness followed, the team exchanging wary glances. No one spoke, but the thought hung in the air like static. Why was this ship still here? The hatch groaned open. Stale air rolled out, cold and thin, carrying the dry metallic scent of abandonment. Flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing narrow corridors coated in dust. The walls bore old markings, company logos long faded, warning labels unreadable under the wear of time. The first steps inside were careful, deliberate. Boots pressed against metal, the sound swallowed almost instantly, as if the ship itself absorbed noise. It was wrong. Ships didn't feel this empty. Even derelicts held echoes, loose cables swaying, the occasional creak of shifting metal, the soft hum of dying systems. But Erebus 7? It was as if the air itself had been drained of sound. Further in, the team split up, moving through the corridors, checking terminals, scanning for data. Someone found the crew quarters bunk doors still sealed, personal effects left behind. A half-rotted book on a pillow. A jacket draped over a chair, stiff with time. No signs of struggle. No signs of evacuation. Just absence. Then, a voice crackled through comms. "You need to see this." In the command center, dust clung to every surface. Control panels, long powered down, sat in stillness. But one screen, just one, flickered weakly. It shouldn't have. There was no power. The tech specialist knelt beside it, tools at the ready. Residual charge, maybe. I can pull the last logs manually. A moment passed. The screen blinked again, a garbled mess of data. Then, as if exhaling its final breath, it stabilized. A log entry appeared. "Do not trust the lights." Silence. The words sat there, stark against the dark screen. A warning? A message left behind? Then, another line flickered into view. We were not alone. One of them muttered a curse under their breath. The tech specialist tapped a few commands, digging deeper. More logs. Corrupted, fragmented, but some still intact. The last recorded entry was dated over 50 years ago. We followed protocol. Everything should have been fine. Then the lights changed. The emergency beacons activated on their own. Crew started seeing things in the corridors. Shadows moving where there was nothing. We sealed the doors, but it didn't matter. Slash, slash. A pause. The next entry was shorter. They left the ship, or they vanished. I don't know anymore. I hear them whispering in the vents. Then one final line, time-stamped mere minutes after the last. If you're reading this, you're already too late. The screen flickered again. Then static. No one spoke. A breath, slow and measured, cut through the silence. Then something clicked in the distance. A soft, rhythmic sound. Like footsteps. The lights overhead flickered just once. A momentary glitch. But it was enough. Enough to send a cold spike of unease down every spine in the room. Someone reached for their communicator, voice low, urgent. We should leave. Now! The words barely escaped before the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come back on. And in the pitch-black corridor beyond the command center, something moved. The darkness swallowed everything. The emergency lights didn't flicker on. The faint glow from the handheld flashlights barely pushed back the void pressing in around them. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, a sound. Soft. Distant. Wrong. A faint shuffle, like something brushing against metal. Someone sucked in a breath. Someone else whispered, "That wasn't us." The tech specialist's fingers hovered over the controls of the terminal, the dim glow from the screen, now their only real light source. But the logs had died. Their final message still burned into the screen's memory. If you're reading this, you're already too late. A flashlight beam cut through the dark, sweeping over control panels, chairs left in disarray, old stains smeared across metal. No blood, just stains. But something about them felt off. A click. The sound of a safety being disengaged. One of them had drawn a weapon. "We need to go." The words were hushed, barely above a whisper, but heavy with urgency. The tech specialist exhaled, forcing their shaking fingers to move. "I need a second. I can get more out of this system. There is no time for." The shuffling sound came again. Closer. The flashlight beams darted toward the corridor. Nothing. Nothing but the open doorway, leading into the dark, into the dead silence beyond. A slow breath. Fine. 30 seconds. The tech's fingers danced across the controls. The screen flickered again, struggling to hold power. More garbled text. More corrupted data. But between the mess, a single line stood out. The ship never lost power. It just stopped using it. What does that mean? No answer. The tech was already moving, bringing up a deeper system scan. The Erebus 7 was still running. The lights. The life support. The atmosphere controls. It was all on, but redirected. Pulled into something deeper within the ship. Someone shifted uneasily. So it's not dead? The screen glitched. For half a second, a new message appeared. "It's watching." Then the entire terminal shut down. A breath hitched. The flashlight beams darted around the room, searching, hunting, desperate for movement, for something solid to put blame on. But there was nothing. Just the stale air and the ever-present sense that something had just changed. Then, from deep inside the ship, a sound. Not a shuffle this time. A click. Like a relay switching over. Like something being activated. The hairs on their arms rose. Enough? We're leaving. No one argued. They backed toward the doorway, eyes never leaving the dark corridor ahead. Every step felt heavier, every breath louder. The ship remained silent, but not the silence of emptiness. The silence of waiting. Their footsteps echoed as they moved back through the halls, retracing their path toward the airlock. The dust on the ground had been undisturbed when they entered, but now faint marks trailed through it, leading deeper into the ship. Not footprints, not human, something else. Someone muttered a curse under their breath. Then, as if the ship had been listening, the emergency lights suddenly flared to life. For a second, it was blinding. For a second, they all froze, blinking hard. And in that second, something moved. A shadow, not a trick of the light. A shape, further down the corridor, standing just beyond the reach of the glow. Tall, unmoving, silent. The light flickered, and it was gone. One of them stumbled back, breath coming sharp and ragged. "Did you?" "Yes," someone else whispered. "Keep moving." The lights buzzed overhead, pulsing like a dying heartbeat. The air felt thicker. Wrong. As they neared the airlock, the tech specialist glanced back just once. The corridor was empty, but the dust on the floor, it was shifting, not from their movement, not from airflow. It was shifting toward them. The first hand slammed against the airlock controls. "Get this open." A pause. Then, the dull chime of the system refusing access. A red light blinked once. LOCKED. A hand hit the panel again. Harder. Override it. I don't. The tech specialist's hands trembled as they fumbled with the controls. The ship's main systems weren't responding. The airlock wasn't malfunctioning. It had been sealed. From the inside, the overhead lights flickered again. For half a second, the corridor beyond them was bathed in darkness. And when the light returned, something was standing in the distance, closer than before, still unmoving, still watching. The breath of the team grew shallow. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, the lights went out completely. A sharp intake of breath. Someone cursed, whispered and desperate, reaching for anything solid in the pitch black. A flashlight beam clicked on, cutting through the void. It swayed, darting wildly. The corridor was empty again. The flashlight beam trembled slightly. Then, as the beam drifted downward toward the floor, footprints, right in front of them, leading closer. Fresh. New. Someone whispered, "We're not alone." The tech specialist choked back panic. The ship's logs there were no bodies. No crew left behind. But something stayed. The airlock panel beeped. Green light. UNLOCKED. No one hesitated. The airlock door slammed open and they stumbled forward, back into the connection tube, moving fast, desperate. Then behind them, the sound of a footstep, not distant, right at the threshold. The lights of the Erebus 7 blinked once more, and for the briefest second, as the airlock began to seal, a silhouette stood in the doorway. Too tall, too still, watching. Then the door slammed shut. Inside the Calypso, alarms flared. Systems rebooted. Everything suddenly felt normal again, as if nothing had ever happened, as if the Erebus 7 had never existed. But the dust had been disturbed, and the logs remained. The last transmission flickered onto their main screen, sent automatically as the Calypso detached from the Erebus 7. One final warning. Do not trust the lights. No one spoke. No one moved. The ship's engines engaged, pulling them away, deeper into the black. But even as the Erebus 7 vanished into the distance, the feeling remained. Like something had followed. The Erebus 7 was gone. At least, that's what the scanners showed. A dead signal. No transponder, no active systems. Just empty space where the ship had been. But no one on the Calypso felt like they had truly left it behind. Inside the cockpit, the pilot ran a final diagnostic. The engines were stable, the hull intact. All readings were normal. And yet, no one spoke. No one moved more than they had to. The silence inside the ship stretched, thick with unspoken tension. The tech specialist sat at the console, staring at the words still lingering on the screen. The last message from the Erebus 7 burned into their mind as much as it was burned into the data logs. Do not trust the lights. A joke. That's what it should have been. A ghost story, an old distress log filled with paranoia from some forgotten crew. But they had seen something, hadn't they? The air in the ship felt heavy. Too still. It was the same ship, the same layout, the same hum of the engines. But something had shifted. A pressure in the back of their minds. Like an unseen weight pressing down. No one mentioned it. No one wanted to. Until the navigator finally broke the silence. We should purge the logs. The words fell flat in the quiet. The tech specialist turned slowly. What? The navigator's hands were tight around the arms of their seat. Their face was pale, their breathing just a little too controlled. The logs. We should wipe them. All of them. Erase the last 2 hours like they never happened. The tech specialist swallowed. That's not why would we do that? The navigator didn't answer at first. Just stared at the screen. At the last recorded transmission. Then, softly, because I don't think it stayed behind, a cold ripple passed through the room. The pilot exhaled through their nose. You're saying what? That something came with us. The navigator didn't nod. Didn't shake their head either. Just looked down, fingers tightening slightly. The pilot cursed under their breath and turned back to the controls. There's nothing here. No signals. No anomalies. Our ship is fine. We're fine. A beat of silence. Then the ship's lights flickered. Just for a second. Barely noticeable. A blink. The breath hitched in the tech specialist's throat. Their fingers moved instinctively, pulling up the power readings. No failures. No disruptions. The ship's core was stable. And yet, they had seen it. The pilot ran a quick systems check. It's probably just... The lights flickered again. Longer this time. When they returned, something in the ship felt different. The tech specialist's hands hovered over the console. Their mouth was dry. I think... They swallowed. I think we need to check the security feed. No one argued. The logs loaded. Frame by frame. The Calypso had 4 internal cameras, 1 for the cockpit, 1 for the engine room, and 2 for the central corridor. The feeds looked normal. Until they didn't. The tech specialist's breath caught. Pause it. The navigator froze the playback. On the corridor feed, right at the edge of the frame, something wasn't right. The shadows were wrong. A faint shape. Unclear. Not a person. Not anything they could recognize. But it was there. And then, in the next frame, it was gone. No one spoke. The pilot finally exhaled. That could be anything. But the words lacked conviction. The navigator didn't look away from the screen. The Erebus 7 never lost power, they murmured. It just stopped using it. The tech specialist's fingers were trembling now. They had read those words in the logs. Had barely understood them at the time. But now they wondered if the Erebus 7 hadn't been drifting because it was dead. Maybe it had been drifting because it had been abandoned. Not by the crew, but by whatever had been keeping the lights on. The pilot straightened suddenly. Wait. Their voice was sharper now, urgent. Where's the timestamp? The navigator frowned. What? The timestamp on the footage. When was this? The tech specialist's eyes flicked to the corner of the screen, and their stomach dropped. The footage had been recorded 5 minutes ago, not before they left the Erebus 7. After. A chime sounded from the ship's mainframe. A soft, rhythmic pulse. The ship's sensors had detected movement. Inside the Calypso. No one breathed. The navigator whispered, "Where?" The screen updated. Corridor B. Directly outside the cockpit. The hairs on the back of the pilot's neck rose. Slowly, so slowly, they turned to face the cockpit door. The light above it flickered. Once, twice, then it went out. The tech specialist reached for the nearest control panel, fingers moving fast, pulling up a new feed. The corridor camera was active, and it was empty. Except the shadows were wrong again, longer than they should have been, stretching in a way that didn't match the walls. A breath, a single whispered thought. It's watching. Then, a noise. Soft, right outside the door. A whisper of movement, barely there. The navigator reached for their sidearm. The pilot did the same. No one spoke. The door's panel flickered. Then the overhead lights went completely dark. And something knocked. The knock echoed through the cockpit, impossibly soft, yet deafening in the silence. No one moved. No one breathed. The tech specialist's hand hovered over the console, fingers locked in place, unwilling to press any key, unwilling to make a sound. Then, another knock. This time, just slightly louder. The navigator's grip tightened on their sidearm. The pilot shifted, slow and deliberate, every movement measured. Their eyes flicked to the ship's internal sensors, still displaying movement detected outside the cockpit door. But there was nothing on the camera. The tech specialist's stomach twisted. The shadows outside the door had shifted. Just slightly. Not enough to be movement, but enough to be wrong. The navigator's breath was shallow. We should open the door. The tech specialist turned, horrified. Are you insane? If it's already in here, it doesn't need doors. The navigator's voice was steady, but their hands weren't. Better to see it than wait. The pilot didn't agree. We don't even know what we're dealing with. The lights above the door flickered again. A pulse, almost like breathing. The tech specialist whispered, I think it wants us to open it. The silence stretched. Then, a third knock. Sharp. Intentional. The pilot swallowed. I'm overriding the cameras. They moved fast, fingers flying over the console, forcing the ship's systems to reroute. A hard reboot. They needed real footage, not whatever distortion was warping the feed. For half a second, the screen glitched. And then, a frame appeared. Clear, sharp. No interference. And something was standing in the corridor. Tall. Shadow thin. No distinct features, no face. Just a shape. A void in the space where nothing should be. And it was facing the door. The navigator inhaled sharply. Then, as if it knew, as if it had been waiting, the thing moved. Not a shift, not a slow turn, a sudden, impossible movement. One frame, it was standing. The next, it was right against the door. The pilot cursed and slammed the emergency lock. Too late. The power flickered. The door control failed. The overhead lights strobed wildly, bathing the cockpit in sharp flashes of white and dark. Then, a sound. Not a knock this time. Something dragging. Something pressing against the metal. A slow, deliberate movement, like fingers trailing across the surface. The tech specialist shook their head, voice barely above a whisper. We have to go. Now. The pilot was already on it, disengaging autopilot, taking full control of the ship. We break orbit, push full burn, put as much distance as we can. The navigator reached for the emergency comms, sending a distress signal. The ship jolted. A shudder that ran through the hull, deep and unnatural. The pilot's eyes widened. What the hell was that? The sensor alarms flared. The ship's readings flickered, and the Calypso's engines shut down. Dead silence. No hum, no vibrations, just stillness. The pilot's hands slammed against the controls. We just lost main power. The navigator was already flipping switches. Emergency systems aren't responding. The ship wasn't just off. It had been turned off. The lights pulsed once more. The knocking stopped. And for the first time, a voice. Not from the comms. Not from the speakers. Inside the cockpit. Soft. Almost human. "Stay." The tech specialist choked on air. The pilot grabbed the manual release, forcing emergency power into the backup thrusters. Nothing. The ship remained still. The navigator stared at the door. The shadows beneath it had shifted again. Then, a sharp, sudden whisper. Not words. Not in any language they could recognize. But close. Right next to the door. The pilot exhaled shakily. There has to be a way to restart the core. The tech specialist's hands were slick with sweat, fingers moving in frantic, desperate patterns across the control panels. I don't know how it's even offline. It wasn't failing. It wasn't compromised. It just... A sound cut them off. Metal bending. Slow. Deliberate. The cockpit door was warping inward. Something was pressing against it, pushing through. The shadows stretched further, crawling under the cracks, pulling inside the cockpit. The tech specialist's pulse hammered in their throat. Then, a final whisper. Not from outside the door this time. Behind them. Inside the cockpit. And the lights went out completely. You said, pick up from where the last part ended and write introducing a second plot twist or escalating the main conflict. This section should raise the stakes, surprise the audience, and drive the story toward its climax. Keep building suspense without resolving the main plot, and maintain SEO with relevant keywords. Ensure the narrative flows seamlessly from the previous sections. Also, do not make any headings. Only write story in paragraphs. Also make the script human-centric and don't give feel of AI-generated. Also, don't create violated content which can affect YouTube policy. Chachted. Chachta. Darkness swallowed the cockpit. Not the normal kind. Not the absence of light. Something thicker. Something that pressed against the skin, that filled the lungs, that made the space around them feel smaller, heavier. The tech specialist's breath hitched. They tried to move, tried to reach for the console, but they couldn't. The air felt wrong. Heavy. Thick. Like the ship wasn't just dark. Like the space around them had changed. A whisper. Too close. Not from the door. Not from the cockpit. Right beside them. The tech specialist's throat tightened. Their fingers twitched. They could feel something near them, not touching, but almost. And then the whisper changed. It became words. Not a command. Not a warning. A question. Where were you? The pilot sucked in a sharp breath. Who's there? No answer. The tech specialist swallowed, forcing their voice to work. We don't understand. Where were we? When? The whisper came again. Where were you when they left? A static hum buzzed through the cockpit speakers, but the ship's systems were still dead. The navigator reached out, fumbling for their sidearm. The whisper came again. You don't remember, do you? Something cold slid down the tech specialist's spine. The shadows around them shifted. Not moving, rearranging. The navigator's fingers grazed their weapon. They gritted their teeth, trying to keep their breathing steady. We don't know what you mean. A pause. Then, a sharp knock. But not from the door. From the ceiling. The pilot's gaze snapped upward. The shadows pulsed. The whisper was softer now. That's why you're here. Then the lights flashed back on. Too bright. Too sudden. The cockpit was empty. No figures. No shapes. No shadows. The ship's hum returned. Consoles flickered online. The Calypso's engines sputtered, then roared to life. Everything was normal. The pilot exhaled shakily. The navigator's hands were still clenched. The tech specialist's heart pounded in their ears. And then, the distress signal came back. But it wasn't theirs. It was from another ship. The transmission flickered onto the main screen. A ship, ID, Erebus 7. A message. Live. The navigator's blood ran cold. That's impossible. We saw it. It was dead. The transmission crackled. Then a voice, hoarse, broken, cut through the static. Please, please, if someone can hear this. The crew froze. That voice. It was familiar. Too familiar. The pilot's hands trembled as they ran a verification scan. The distress call's timestamp. It wasn't old. It was from 4 minutes ago. The tech specialist felt something in their chest collapse. Because now, they knew why the whisper had asked, "Where were you?" The pilot turned pale. The navigator's grip on their weapon slackened. Because the Erebus 7 wasn't lost. Because the voice in the distress signal, it was theirs. The distress signal played on repeat. The same desperate voice, the same words, over and over again. The tech specialist's fingers hovered over the console, unable to process what they were seeing. The pilot swallowed hard, stealing a glance at the navigator, who was deathly still, eyes locked on the screen. The ship ID didn't change. Erebus 7. The ship that had gone dark. The ship that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. But the worst part wasn't the name. It was the voice. Because it was theirs. Not someone else's. Not a distorted recording. The pilot's own voice, frayed with exhaustion. The navigator's voice, trembling with fear. The tech specialist's own ragged breaths, breaking through the static. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. And then, something else changed. The distress signal updated. New coordinates flashed across the screen. The exact location of the Calypso. They were transmitting a distress call from a ship they weren't on, a ship that had already been lost. The pilot's stomach turned. This isn't real. The navigator's voice was barely above a whisper. Then why does it know where we are? The tech specialist's hands shook as they forced themselves to type, running a scan on the incoming signal. It had to be a trick, an echo, something bouncing through space from years ago. But the scan returned an answer, one that made their blood run cold. The Erebus 7 was 1 kilometer away. Dead in space. No movement. No life signs. But sending a live transmission. The crew sat frozen, barely breathing. The pilot's fingers twitched over the thruster controls. We burn out of here. Now, the navigator was already keying in the sequence. Charging engines. A system warning flashed across the console. Manual override engaged. Unable to proceed. The ship wasn't responding. The tech specialist's heart pounded. We're locked out. A new message appeared on the screen. Not from their ship. From the Erebus 7. Just 3 words. DONTLO, OKB-ACK. The cockpit lights flickered. Then, a knock. Soft. Close. From behind them, the pilot's breath hitched. The navigator's hands curled into fists. The tech specialist's pulse hammered in their ears. Slowly, too slowly, they turned. The cockpit door was open. They hadn't heard it unlock. Hadn't seen it move. But it was open, wide enough to see out into the corridor. Wide enough to see something standing there. Not a shadow. Not a shape. Themselves. 3 figures, identical. Their own faces staring back. The copy stood still, watching. Their expressions were empty, eyes too dark, bodies slightly off. Like a reflection in water, almost right, but wrong. The tech specialist tried to speak, but nothing came out. The other them finally moved. The one that looked like the pilot smiled. And then, in their own voice, it whispered, "We should have left sooner." The lights cut out. And this time, they didn't come back on. Silence stretched through the darkness. No hum of the ship, no flickering screens. Just the weight of nothing pressing against them. The tech specialist tried to move, but it felt like something was holding them in place, not physically, but in the way a nightmare traps you just before you wake up. Then, a sound. Footsteps. Not theirs. The navigator sucked in a sharp breath. They're still here. The pilot's fingers twitched toward their belt, but the sidearm was gone. Their heart pounded as the footsteps came closer, slow and deliberate, each step echoing louder than it should. A whisper, right at their ear. This was never your ship. The tech specialist shuddered. They could feel something right next to them, something they couldn't see but knew was there. And then light. Not from the cockpit, but from outside the ship. A pale, distant glow filtering through the viewport. It wasn't a sun. It wasn't a star. It was the Erebus 7. It was awake. Panels along its hull flickered with faint, ghostly light. Shapes moved behind its shattered windows, shadows where no one should be. The distress call was still coming through, looping endlessly, but now, beneath it, something else had joined the transmission. A second voice, speaking in a language they didn't know, but understood. The navigator exhaled sharply. They never left. The pilot's throat was dry. Who? The answer came not from their ship, but from the transmission itself. A whisper, tangled in the static. Us. A violent lurch rocked the Calypso. The ship's systems flared back to life all at once, alarms screaming through the cockpit. The emergency lights flickered, and the weight holding them in place suddenly lifted. The tech specialist gasped, stumbling forward as if reality had just let them go. The pilot didn't hesitate. They grabbed the thruster controls and slammed the emergency override. The ship jerked hard, engines roaring to life, burning away from the Erebus 7 with every ounce of power it had left. The navigator was already running calculations, plotting the fastest route away. The tech specialist's hands flew over the console, bypassing every lock system, forcing the ship back into their control. Then, the cockpit door slammed shut. The pilot's breath hitched. What now? A sound cut them off. Not static, not whispers. A heartbeat. Slow, deep, coming from the ship itself. The screens flashed again, and for the briefest second, themselves stared back from the reflections. The tech specialist's voice was barely a whisper. We were never supposed to leave. The pilot gritted their teeth and pushed the thrusters harder. Well, we're leaving. The Calypso surged forward, breaking free from the gravitational pull of the Erebus 7. The shadowy glow of the lost ship began to fade, swallowed by the void behind them. But as the distance grew, the distress call didn't weaken. It didn't flicker out. It followed, looping in the speakers, echoing in their heads. A message not for them, but from them. The navigator stared at the readings, pulse hammering. It's still transmitting. The tech specialist's fingers trembled. It's us. We're the ones sending it. We've always been sending it. The pilot's jaw clenched, knuckles white against the controls. That doesn't make sense. But the deeper truth clawed at them, a realization settling like cold steel in their gut. The Erebus 7 had never been abandoned. There had never been bodies because the crew had never died. They had become something else. Something stuck. And now, the Calypso had taken their place. The distress call wasn't coming from the Erebus anymore. It was coming from them. The moment they had heard it, the loop had begun. And somewhere, in some version of time or space, another them was hearing the call for the first time. The navigator exhaled shakily. We have to shut it down. The tech specialists shook their head. It's not that simple. It's not a signal. It's a cycle. The pilot's hands tightened over the controls. Then we break it. The ship's readings flickered again. The engine strain was reaching critical levels. They didn't have much time before something or someone forced them back into the dark. The distress call crackled, and for the first time, a new phrase cut through the loop. Their own voice. They didn't leave. We never left. The tech specialist's breath hitched. That's it. The navigator's brow furrowed. What? The tech specialist looked at them, heart pounding. The only way to stop the loop is to leave it behind. The pilot's expression hardened. Explain. The tech specialist's fingers flew across the console, isolating the transmission code. If we let it play, it keeps pulling us in. It's a door, and the only way to close a door is to stop knocking. The navigator's eyes widened. You want to mute the distress call? The tech specialist swallowed. Not just mute it. We have to cut it off completely. No trace. No signal. No response. The moment we stop listening, it stops existing for us. The pilot exhaled sharply. And if it doesn't work? The tech specialist met their gaze. Then we were never really here to begin with. A long, heavy silence. Then the pilot nodded. Do it. The tech specialist's hands moved fast, breaking every connection, overriding every protocol. The transmission fought back, flickering, twisting, trying to stay alive. The cockpit lights dimmed as the ship seemed to protest. Then, a final whisper. Don't forget us. And the signal went silent. The cockpit lights stabilized. The alarms cut off. The hum of the Calypso settled into something normal again. The navigator let out a shaky breath. Did it work? The pilot checked the sensors. Nothing. No distress call. No ghostly echoes. No Erebus 7. Just empty space. The navigator leaned back, rubbing their face. I don't ever want to hear static again. The tech specialist exhaled, hands still trembling. We made it out. The pilot let the words sink in before nodding. Yeah, we did. The navigator looked out the viewport, scanning the endless void ahead. Do you think they're still out there? The tech specialist didn't answer, because they weren't sure. Somewhere, in some fractured moment of time, another version of them was probably still hearing the call, still answering it, still trapped in the loop. But not this time. Not them. The pilot engaged the course for deep space, putting more distance between them and whatever they had left behind. The navigator leaned back, eyes heavy with exhaustion. The tech specialist stared at the screen one last time, half expecting the transmission to flicker back to life. But it never did. And as the Calypso burned into the unknown, the void remained quiet. For now.